Hello everyone. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the incremental model. So this is a model that was developed after waterfall was kind of identified as being an issue because of it being very rigid and taking you through phase by phase and not allowing you to go back. The incremental model helped with that a little bit. So the key thing with the incremental model is it's a combination of both the linear progression, so a waterfall type of progression, where you can only go forward, and an iterative approach, meaning you circle back multiple times and iterate through something to complete it. And the reason that I do this one after the waterfall is it's very similar because it does what they call mini waterfalls. You're ultimately working through a linear progression multiple times. And so you're working through the different phases. You can't go backwards, but then you iterate back to the beginning and you work through it again. And what that helps with is if requirements change, you can kind of continue forward in the way that you were assuming to be doing it, or your requirements had dictated you were going to be doing it. But then in that next incrementation or the next iteration, you're able to go back and adjust those requirements and adjust that development that was done, as well as you can add additional features. So you can kind of, okay, let's start here, and then once we get that done, we'll be able to circle back and determine what other features and enhancements we want to add to the particular product to get us through to solve those business needs. The kind of other piece to the incremental model is it focuses more heavily on shortening up the long pole that was in the waterfall model and really delivering something earlier. So the incremental model, the kind of that mini waterfall is called a mini waterfall because you may not be cutting steps out of it, but you will be cutting time to complete. So since you're going through the same steps but with less requirements, knowing that you don't have to get all those requirements listed and documented in that initial kind of run through, that initial iteration, you're able to go through, get something created, get something tangible for the business to utilize, and it just helps a lot with that. So looking at the little picture that I have, the little depiction I have on the slide, I only have a few phases here, but that's just to kind of show you overall how this works. So you go from an analysis phase where you're working to identify requirements. You move then into a design phase where you're taking those requirements and you're creating or designing some type of solution to meet that. And then the implementation phase is where you're actually doing the coding, the testing, and working through that piece. Once you're done there, you iterate back through, and now you're back at requirements gathering again. And you do that a number of times until the business feels comfortable and the project team feels comfortable that the end product, that end result, meets those business needs and those initial requirements that were designated at the beginning of the project. And then finally you deploy that product, whether that's deploying it into a production environment for users or putting that into some type of marketplace if you're looking to sell it. So what are some pros and cons to the incremental model? Well, as we stated, one of the huge pros is you're able to provide some value early on. So as you've worked through that mini waterfall and you've worked all the way through, you've given the business users something tangible to look at and to play with and to see what they like about it, and then have them be able to come up with additional ideas. And that kind of goes into the second one, where you can come up with additional requirements or adjust requirements now that you've seen it, now that it's visual and you're utilizing it. It just helps to be able to kind of work through and say, oh, okay, now that I see that, here's what I want to adjust, or here's some additional things we want to do to be able to make sure that we're meeting our needs. Another thing is your problems can be detected pretty early. So since you're working through a mini waterfall, you get to the users and they may say, whoa, this is nothing like what we wanted. This we're going in the wrong direction. So in the waterfall, if you remember, problems are usually detected at that testing phase, but that is way down the line of that waterfall model. With the incremental model, yes, they're probably detecting it in the testing phase, but that's not as far down since you're doing just a very small segment of those initial requirements and working through your iterations. And another pro is that you can utilize knowledge that you've learned throughout those other iterations. So this is a nice one if you don't know the solution very well. So you don't know exactly what you're going to be doing, or you're going to be custom building something. You can say, you know what, let's get something out there and let's kind of throw something on paper, get it out there, work it through the full process, and give it to the users, let them look at it, and then we can learn from that as to what hurdles we ran into, what's difficult or easy, and that way as you move into the next iteration, you have that learning, that knowledge. Some of the cons to it is there is still a decent amount of documentation that's done in the incremental model. So as you're working through, you're still doing analysis, and then that kind of waterfalls, if you will, or phases into the next stage of the design, and then that phases into the next stage of the implementation. So you're still working through and still utilizing the output of the previous phase or stage as input in that next phase. So you still get a lot of documentation, and especially around when you're interfacing with other systems. And the big problem is when you're doing small iterations, you're generally not going to tackle that huge problem, that huge data integration. And so you're going to have to really document that out in the requirements, and that might be an iteration in itself where you're adding in that type of data integration with your system. The next thing is when you're iterating through, you can lose track of that big picture, lose track of what that business need was, what that business problem was that you were trying to solve for. So you're kind of working through, iterating, and pretty soon you're like, wait a minute, what were we solving for? We're just throwing these features and enhancements at this product that we're building, but we have no real end result. And so you can just kind of iterate forever and never really get to that deployment. And the last con, or kind of the last big con, is that, like I had mentioned earlier, the bigger problems tend to kind of get pushed aside. So, we'll handle that in the next iteration. We don't want to handle that now, right? We want to add the more fun features. And so those issues and those roadblocks get pushed off to different iterations, and ends up causing you a lot of problems when you go to tackle it, because now you have this big system with all these different features and enhancements that you've created over multiple iterations that you're looking to kind of integrate it with. So when is it good to use an incremental model? The big reason you'd want to use this is you don't have the requirements very well defined. It's difficult. Users don't know what they want. They don't know what they don't know. And so this is going to be a large project, and since they don't know, trying to do a waterfall model would take forever, right? You'd be in the analysis phase, and it would be very hard to get them to visualize and understand what you're trying to depict, as well as it would be difficult for you to be able to pull out the requirements out of them because they don't really know what they want. So any type of large project where they don't know what they want, an incremental type of model would work good. Another one is if you're working in unfamiliar technical areas. So we kind of alluded to it a little bit in the pros and cons section, but if you're working in a solution, maybe you're working in a product where you're configuring that product to meet your business needs, and you don't know that product real well. So you know a little bit about the product, you know what you can utilize it for, but you don't really know how to get it there. Well, this could be a good one for that. Hey, let's start somewhere, let's get used to the product, and then as we work through, we'll learn stuff and be able to utilize that in our future iterations. The next one is if requirements are constantly changing, like in leading edge applications, this can work well just because you can increment through. Honestly, there's better methodologies that you can utilize for kind of leading edge or bleeding edge technology, and we'll get to those later. But this one is one that you can utilize for that, and it will work. The next one is business users need to be moderately to heavily engaged in the project. Since there's many waterfalls, you're not segmented like you are in the waterfall model. The waterfall model kind of has it where the business analyst works with the business to develop those requirements, and then the business analyst works with the solution designers to design out the solution. And at that point, when you're in the design stage, the business users are pretty much off doing their own thing, and they're not having to be engaged in the project until the approval comes out. Well, in this one, since the waterfall is so short, you're going through your requirements. Well, the design doesn't take as long because you're not having to design for as many requirements. So you need the business to be engaged to then approve. And then you need the business to be engaged right away because the implementation is not going to take very long. So they need to be more engaged. And the level of engagement, whether it's moderate or heavy, really depends on how long your iterations are. If you have a 2-month iteration, well, then maybe the business users can be moderately engaged. But if you have a 1-month iteration or less, then they're going to have to be more engaged because you're going to be moving through requirements analysis, getting approval on the design, testing that implementation that was done, the coding that was done, and you're circling right back to features and enhancements and analysis phase again. So they definitely have to be engaged more. And then the next thing is the functional requirements. You need to be able to turn them into something quickly, right? So a good when to use this is when that needs to happen, when the business needs to be able to see it. And they need to have something tangible that they can utilize right away. Maybe there's an urgent need. So they want to build this software suite or the software application, and it's going to take care of this huge, huge problem. That's going to create all these efficiencies for them. But there's one critical component that needs to be done really quickly. Maybe there's a government change that's happening where they're regulating and saying this needs to be done by such and such a date. So this model can work well if you need to quickly get something out the door and deployed or usable and tangible in the business's hands. So that's the incremental model. Very similar to the waterfall model, but shortens up the phases, shrinks that down because it works with just a segment of requirements at a time and increments through multiple times until it's ready for deployment.